Hello, I'm Michael Brown, president of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this first Creative Thought Forum event of 2022. The event's presented in partnership with the Santa Fe Council on International Relations and will feature two distinguished experts on China. We're grateful to our Creative Thought Forum series sponsors for their help in sponsoring this event. They include the Dui Foundation, Thornburg Investment Management, Mark Sublet and the Medicine Man Gallery, Luke J. and the Betty M. Vortman Endowment Fund, the Flora Crichton Lecture Fund, and members of SAR's Founder Society. For those of you who don't know SAR, and I think given the size of this audience, that will apply to some of you, we are a nonprofit research institution founded in 1907. So this is our 115th year of operations. Our focus is on Native American arts and social sciences with a particularly deep history in anthropology and archaeology. Deep roots in the Southwest, but we also have global ambitions, and I think they're in evidence today. Events like this are made possible by the generous support of our donors and members, as well as our sponsors. If you'd like more information on becoming an SAR member, and we do have a relatively inexpensive digital membership for our online events, please visit our website at members.sarsf.org. Our website will be shown in the chat line, as well as that of the Dui Hua Foundation, represented by John Kamm and by the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. We appreciate voluntary donations. This event is offered without any charge to members and guests, and we also upload it to YouTube, to the SAR YouTube channel. The format is pretty straightforward. Our presenters will speak each for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll go to the Q&A part. Please, if you have questions, present them in the Q&A panel rather than the chat panel of your Zoom window. That makes it easier for me to process them on the fly. So let me introduce our speakers today. John Kamm is the founder, chairman, and executive director of the Dui Hua Foundation in San Francisco. He's an American businessman and human rights campaigner, active in China since 1972. He was awarded the Department of Commerce's Best Global Practices Award by President Bill Clinton in 1997, and the Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights by President George W. Bush in 2001. In September 2004, he received a MacArthur Fellowship for his human rights work, the first businessman to be awarded a MacArthur Fellowship. He's made more than 100 trips to China to engage the government in a dialogue on human rights, focusing on the treatment of prisoners and the conditions in Chinese prisons. In the words of the New York Times, no other person or organization in the world, including the State Department, has helped more Chinese prisoners than John Kamm. I have to say, in the interest of full disclosure, that John and I have known each other for a very long time. We met and worked together at a Navajo high school in New Mexico in the 70s, which is how I got to know him before he left for his distinguished career in China. Our second speaker, equally distinguished, is Joseph Fewsmith III, Professor of International Relations and Political Science at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies. Fewsmith is the author-editor of 9 books, including most recently Rethinking Chinese Politics in 2021. Other works include The Logic and Limits of Political Reform in China and China since Tiananmen's second edition, 2008. He's one of 7 regular contributors to the Chinese Leadership Monitor, a quarterly web publication analyzing current developments in China. I'm going to mute out and turn over what would you call it? Turn over the screen to Joseph Fewsmith, and then John Kamm will follow. So Joseph, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. That was very generous, kind introduction. And I will address a little bit Sino-US relations and the domestic situation in China. I think everybody's aware that Sino-US relations have really never been as bad as they are now, probably since Nixon went to China in 1972. There are a lot of reasons for this downturn in our relationship. But I think the way that I'd like to approach this is looking at it through a domestic political lens, in part because 2022 is the year in which the 20th Party Congress will be held. And it appears at this point that Xi Jinping, who has already served 2 terms as head of the party, will go for a 3rd term. And this will break a pattern of at least the last 2 party secretaries, which stepped down after 2 terms, and raises a lot of questions about the Chinese political system. And to a certain extent, those questions influence the relationship between the United States and China. I think that because Xi Jinping appears to be going for a 3rd term this year, I wanted to look at the succession issue in particular. And one of the sort of interesting insights into that comes from a book written, 1989, what is that, 3 years ago, by Wang Huning. He was then a young professor at Fudan University in Shanghai, and he is now on the Politburo Standing Committee, making him one of the 7 people who run China. In 1989, Wang Huning spent 6 months in the United States and wrote a very interesting book called America Against America. And he picks up a lot of our social issues, which I'm actually kind of surprised how much he picked up in those at that time, because a lot of those issues were not as prominent then as they became later. But there's one really quite positive vignette that he has. He goes to the inauguration of President H.W. Bush, Bush Sr., if you will, and he describes it in some detail. The very formal inauguration ceremony, Bush's inaugural address, and then the part that is really interesting is he has him going over to the White House and commenting that he moves into the White House without any problem, that Ronald Reagan, the former president, has departed. And he says that it's just absolutely unimaginable that Ronald Reagan would have stayed around or tried to hold on to the office of the presidency and the residence of the White House. I wish we could say the same thing today. It's quite telling in the time that the American politics have changed dramatically. But here he is. China has come out of the Cultural Revolution about 10 years earlier than that. And he's looking at American politics, and what does he find attractive? He finds the institutionalization of succession to be one of the really attractive features of the United States. That it becomes, as I say, really unimaginable that you would have a power struggle. And of course, in China, not only in the Cultural Revolution, but for most of 20th century China, you've had nothing but power struggles. And now he is literally shoulder by shoulder with the man who is going to cling to office for a 3rd term. And I'm sure we can't go and interview Wang Huning, but it sure would be interesting to have a conversation with him and say, so what do you think of the lack of institutionalization in China? And this really struck me a couple of weeks ago when I found an interview with a man by the name of Fang Ning, who is the former president of the Institute of Politics at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And he was reflecting on the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he said, what really caused the collapse of the Soviet Union was the lack of institutionalization. They never got the succession problem down. In other words, you always had power struggles at the time of the transfer of power. And ultimately, these power struggles, the lack of institutionalized succession, led to the lack of legitimacy, and the lack of legitimacy led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. As I say, that was only a couple of weeks ago. And, he doesn't make the direct connection, but it doesn't take much imagination to say that he's reflecting on the current situation in China. I might say Fang Ning, I've known him for some years. He's always had a reputation of being quite a conservative person that has always accepted and argued in favor of China's socialist system. And here he says, he doesn't comment, of course, on China directly. He can't do that. But he's saying, the Soviet Union collapsed because they never got this succession issue down. So I think I can conclude that a lot of people in China are watching what's going on in China, particularly the lack of institutionalized succession, and saying, we should be getting that down. Xi Jinping really should not be running, well, running is the wrong word, playing political games in order to secure a third term in office. The powers of a general secretary in China and the lack of institutionalization raise a lot of political questions in China. I remember in 2012, not long before Xi Jinping became general secretary at the 18th Party Congress, he disappeared for 2 weeks in September of that year. And I think that there was a lot of interesting politics that went on in those 2 weeks. But the issue that I wanted to raise was, what if something had really happened to Xi Jinping? What if it was not just a political disappearance? What if he'd had a heart attack, incapacitated, perhaps died? Who was going to take over? Would the premier, Li Keqiang, who really comes from a different political network, would he take over? Highly unlikely. There's not an institutionalized sense of succession that the vice president would move into the presidency the general secretaryship. There is no vice secretary, general secretary of the party. I would think that they would have to go and convene a meeting, perhaps at their site at Beidaihe, and really hash out the succession issues. It would have been throwing everything open. It would have been an extremely difficult meeting, and who knows how it would have come out, but it would have just highlighted the idea that that these are all negotiated deals, if you will, on who takes over control of the party. It also raises this issue of political networks or factionalism. If Xi Jinping doesn't control it, who does? And when a new person like Xi Jinping takes over as general secretary, it seems like it's an inevitable process that he is going to appoint people that he knows, that he trusts, to various critical positions that control the party. People like in the organization department, the propaganda department, the security forces, the military. And believe me, since 2012, when he became general secretary, all those positions have changed, and they have gone to people who have close political ties to Xi Jinping. So the structure of the political system, the lack of institutionalization, the lack of institutionalized succession really does create factionalism and the need for it. And when you look at this and you say, gee, it is factionalized, and when one faction takes over and another gets thrown out, if you will, that creates a lot of instability in the system. And indeed, the idea that Xi Jinping will continue to serve a third and quite probably a fourth term, the impact of that is you're saying, not just to another group of people, wait your turn, but your term's not coming at all. You're out. And that seems to me to build up a certain resentment and hostility on the part of other political actors. I think it also leads to a certain cynicism in the party and in the public at large that says, that this is just not a legitimate political system. And that's a sentiment that, by the way, coexists with sort of the opposite, the heightened sense of nationalism that is now so prevalent in China. So you have very different political forces going on. And I think that over time, this is not a good thing. Obviously, the nationalism sets China on a collision course with the United States, even as the lack of institutionalized succession erodes the legitimacy of the party within the party. So I think that this leads to a lot of the tensions that we see in the relationship. And I think it also leads to a lot of the human rights abuses that we see today, including those in Tibet and in Xinjiang area, the Uyghurs. And I think to address those issues, there is simply nobody better qualified in the world than John Kamm. And so I will yield my camera and microphone to John. John, take it over.
Okay, well, thank you, Joe. That's a tough act to follow. So good to be here, and I'm delighted that we have such a great turnout. Michael Brown mentioned that we met in Rama, New Mexico in the summer of 1971. One evening, Michael and I and two other friends were sitting around a table. We were playing cards, having a drink, and we had the radio on. And on came the news that Henry Kissinger had visited China, and that next year, early next year, President Nixon would visit China. That was 1972. So Michael spoke up and said, well, John, you can finally start using your Chinese. And indeed, what happened was the next summer, I left for China. My first, we seem to be having a little noise in the background. It'll pass, don't worry. Okay, so anyway, I go off to China in the summer of 1972. So I have been in China, working in China for about 50 years, all right? And I agree with Professor Fewsmith. Relations between the United States and China are now at the lowest point in those 50 years that I can recall. So by the way, that story, you can find part of it in this book, which has just been published, called Americans in China. Now, I would like to talk a little bit, sort of the core of my talk here has to do with a very recent meeting. I understand from a source inside China that at the end of November, a senior leader, I believe it was Li Keqiang, convened an internal meeting of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And at that meeting, at that very meeting, the senior leader instructed China's ambassador and consul general in the United States that they needed to meet with friendly Americans. Those meetings have not been taking place. So I was contacted and asked if I would like to meet with, in fact, a senior diplomat. And that meeting took place on January the 5th here in San Francisco. It was an in-person meeting. So I was asked to speak first, and I did so. And here's what I said. First of all, I pointed out, it was a very frank, maybe a little blunt, I hope on both sides. I pointed out that today, China really has no friends in Washington, D.C. Now, that was not always the case, by the way. Even after Tiananmen, there were members of Congress who were quite friendly to China, like Doug Beereiter from Nebraska or Jim Leach from New Jersey. No longer do we find that. And I suspect that Washington doesn't have a whole lot of friends in Beijing either. Okay, so let me move. So what were the points I made? First, no friends in Washington. Then I said US-China relations are characterized by very low public opinion. And here you see on your screens a graph of China's favorable ratings by the Gallup organization. They have polled attitudes of Americans on China going back many years. I only show here 78. I think they went back before that, right after the Second World War. And what you will see here is that in the 70s, at a time when I was in China, going to China, China's favorability was quite good, quite high. And then you see, after Tiananmen, right before Tiananmen, China had a 72% favorable rating. After Tiananmen, it was cut in half, and it took years to recover, all right? Also in 2021, Gallup polled, and Americans replied, that China is now considered America's biggest adversary, 45% of Americans. The year before, it was 22%. So in 1 year, you had a doubling of people in the United States who think China is an adversary, okay? Now that's, so I would say here that I'm quite sure if there were such polls in China, you would find that America is quite unpopular. But there is one very interesting difference that I can make out between the two countries. In the United States, younger people have a more favorable impression of China than older people. In China, my sense is that younger people have a lower opinion than the older people. That's my sense. So it's an interesting difference. Now, moving ahead, I then said, okay, we've covered no friends in Washington, low popularity. We look at the 117th Congress, which is what the Congress is right now. We are in the second session of that Congress. And during that session, during the first session, which ended on January 3rd, this is pretty incredible, there were 352 bills and resolutions with China content introduced in that Congress. That is an incredible number, 352. And now we've started the second session. Now, one of those bills that was introduced and which passed is the Uyghur Forced Labor Act. Now, that bill is quite extraordinary. it establishes the presumption of guilt. In other words, if you are importing something from Xinjiang, it is presumed to have been made with forced labor. Presumption of guilt, that is pretty extraordinary. And so that's one of the bills. Now, the other thing I would point, you're well aware, of course, you look at it every day. Democrats and the Republicans are not getting along, all right? They're fighting about everything, with one exception, China. So if you look at what has unified the two parties, it's China, opposition to China. So that's what's going on there. Now, I also pointed out that it's very, very unusual to find positive stories on China in the media in the United States. And again, here in China, you don't see a lot of favorable articles about the United States. Just today, I go on, I do this every day. I look at, what's the news and what do we see? Okay, you see conflict in the South China Sea between the two countries. Okay, you see a report on the French Parliament pushing the French government to declare genocide in Xinjiang. You see another report on the European Parliament condemning China for its abuses in Hong Kong. In one day, in one morning, you get these three stories, and it goes on and on. I actually used to try to keep track, but after about 3 pages, single-spaced things that have happened that affect U.S.-China relations, I gave up. It's just too much. So that's another characteristic. Now, finally, I pointed out to my Chinese friends that polling, there have been 4 polls actually on Joe Biden handling of China, 4. The first one was not too bad. Then after the meeting in Anchorage between US and Chinese senior diplomats, which went very poorly, the whole game changed to the extent that right now, in the most recent poll taken in November, 60% of Americans think that Joe Biden is too weak on China. 4% think he's too hard. So 60%. So I said, look, the president is going to be, it is very, very difficult for him to move in that kind of an environment. And sure enough, if you looked at the president's press conference yesterday, one of the issues is, of course, tariffs. And I'll get into that in just a bit. This is not all about human rights, but tariffs, okay? And Mr. Biden was asked, does the United States intend to lift the tariffs? And his answer was, well, not now, not ready, okay? So there you can see, even if he wanted to lift the tariffs, he would find that very difficult, okay. So I kind of finished up with that, except I did say one more thing. And I mean this very sincerely, based on my experience of working on prisoner cases for more than 30 years, I believe that the best way for China to improve its image in the United States is to practice what I call strategic acts of clemency. And you can start with American citizens. And I mentioned 3 citizens in alphabetical order by surnames. Mr. Li Kai, Mr. Pastor David Lin, and finally, American citizen Mark Sweden, in whose case I have taken a strong personal interest. Mr. Sweden has been in a Chinese detention center for more than 9 years without adjudication. That's extraordinary, 9 years. And I tell you, when I bring this up with my Chinese friends, many of them are quite embarrassed by that. Now, if China wants to improve its image, and I assume it does, it can start by releasing these American citizens, all right? So I move on now. How did the senior official reply? Well, he said something very interesting. He said, Mr. Kamm, our cooperation, in other words, cooperation on prisoners, is undermined by the poor state of relations between the two countries, which, of course, is true. It's very rare for an official to say, hey, you know, the reason we're not doing this is because the relationship is so poor, you see? So he made that point. He then went on to say something very interesting. He said, you know, John, Mr. Kamm, people thought that relations would improve after Mr. Biden took office. Instead, they have continued to deteriorate. So he said that. Then he talked about tariffs and inflation. He says, look at that, all right? You want to tame inflation in the United States. Well, why don't you lift the tariffs? Even your Secretary Yellen has suggested that. So why don't you do that? Well, I referenced that above. Then, of course, he talked about genocide. And he, of course, was very unhappy that the United States is calling out China for committing genocide. All right, he said, you know, Secretary Blinken in his confirmation hearings, before he even started the job, he slammed China for genocide. He said, why did he do that? Couldn't he have just said at that point, you know, I will look into this, you know, et cetera. No, he just said, yes, it's genocide. And he just, I don't understand that, he said. He also pointed out, and this is true, that no other government in the world except the United States has called what China is doing in Xinjiang genocide. Legislatures have, but executive branches haven't. He pointed that out. Then he said, I'm going through everything he said, you know, again, Mr. Kamm, we should be cooperating on the pandemic, all right? We both are approaching this in different ways. We should learn from each other instead of pointing the finger. Well, of course, certainly ex-President Trump has, of course, called it the China virus, which has offended a lot of people, of course. And of course, in China, too, they are blaming the United States, including, you may have seen most recently, that it's being mailed to China in envelopes, in mail. So again, here on the pandemic. And finally, the senior diplomat said to me, Mr. Kamm, China has 400 million people who are middle income. In a few years, that will be 800 million, and the United States will have been surpassed by China in GDP. And he said, as things stand, we will be locked in confrontation, and locked in confrontation, set in stone. So unless something is done, the United States will lose that market. All right. I would like to conclude my remarks and leave time for a Q&A by making one final point. The United States and China are not talking to each other right now, okay? I briefed the State Department on my discussions with this gentleman, and basically they said, wow, you know, that's incredible. I've also done that with the UN. And they say, we don't have those conversations. You know, we're not able to hand over prisoner lists, which I did this time, talk about prisoners. We can't do that. We don't have any conversation. And in fact, you should be aware that at the end of the Obama administration, the United States and China had more than 60 dialogues and consultations on a wide range of topics. Everything you can imagine. Right now, I suspect we may have 5, a reduction from 60 to 5. We're not talking to each other. And unless you talk to each other, you're not going to be able to resolve differences. So on that note, I would like to sign off. I don't know who takes over from here.
I'm coming in. Stay on board, and Joe, join us, if you will. There he is.
There we are.
We've got questions coming in. I want to start with one of my own, and it's to John about the Uyghurs. So I think we can call it the persecution of the Uyghurs. Is that driven by Han ethnocentrism? Are there genuine security issues that the Chinese are worried about? Is it related to government, something that Joe referred to, which was the increasing nationalism, which was promoted by at least some factions of the government? What's your understanding of it?
Well, if you look at the history, the current situation was prompted by, in particular, I believe it was in Kunming, Joe can correct me, there was an attack that wound up killing with knives, Uyghurs killing Han, large numbers. So that, after that, it touched off. And, you know, here we are today, what's going on in Xinjiang. Now, the United States government says it's genocide. For those of you who are interested, there's a book called East Street, West Street. And that tells the history of the origins of the two crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, these two, okay? And based on my reading of that book, I think it is more appropriate to refer to crimes against humanity than genocide. Crimes against humanity refer to crimes against individuals. That's what I do. I press the Chinese government on individual cases, of which there are many. I do not make sweeping statements like China is practicing genocide. I stick with crimes against humanity. But look, I mean, there are many things going on. There is Han ethnocentrism, for sure. But there are, in the minds of the central leaders, legitimate security concerns, okay? I'll leave it there.
Joe, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, you know, I've always said that China is a multi-ethnic country, but it's not a multicultural country. It really, for whatever reasons, nationalism, Han ethnocentrism, I think the agenda has, from really the beginning, been to try to wield a common culture, and it's a Han culture. And, you know, even some of the sort of progressive things that China has done, like invite Uyghurs or Tibetans to attend universities in the East, a large part of the agenda there is to acculturate them, to make them Chinese. And, you know, I think that some of those attitudes are really at the root of this. And, you know, I have to say, in talking to my friends in China, there's not a lot of sympathy for Muslims. They see Islam the way some Americans do, as, you know, inevitably violent, you know, disruptive of their polities. And so unfortunately, I don't think you get much sympathy among the Chinese population for what's going on in Xinjiang.
I'm going to ask one or more of my own questions, then we'll turn to the questions pouring in here. Joe, when you were talking about Xi Jinping and the sort of factionalization or factionalism, how do they deal with the growing social inequality in China? I mean, there's so many paradoxes. On the one hand, it's this as orthodox a communist country as you can find in certain ways, and yet it's clearly capitalist and there's tremendous wealth being generated. So how does the government reconcile those tensions, or do they fail at that?
Yeah. Well, you know, let me mention one book that's come out recently called Red Roulette by Desmond, can't remember his last name. Sham, yeah. Just a wonderful read. And if you want to know how to do business in China, maybe John can remember these days of wheeling and dealing and building personal relationships and getting cut in on particular deals. And for those who can get in on that game, you can make a lot of money. very, very quickly. And, certainly the New York Times has highlighted some of these in their investigation of Ping An Insurance and so forth. So, it is a little bit like our Wild West days when you could make a lot of money speculating if you knew the right people and could get in on the ground floor. And certainly there's been a lot of inequality. China has shot from probably the most equal country in the world to one of the least equal countries in the world. And, over the recent months, you've seen a new emphasis from the government on common prosperity. And I'm not sure whether the crackdown that we've seen on some of the internet companies is part of that, whether the government sees it as part of this common prosperity, or whether it's sort of a separate agenda of the government is in control here, folks. But I think you are seeing an effort to level the top, which it's very interesting. Back just a decade or so ago, there was an effort to rein in some of the companies because they'd been looting state-owned assets as you transferred state-owned enterprises to private enterprises, and they really were robbing the government. And so there were some bills that got a lot of controversy. Then there was the economists pushed back. They said, look, trying to solve inequality problems by shooting the wealthy is not going to work. The idea is to keep the economy going and let people at the bottom work their ways up. My point being that those were people defending a market-oriented, law-based system. And now I don't hear any of those voices. The government is trying to level the system in this populist way, and you're not getting the pushback. And I think that could, whether the intention is to really bring about a more equal society or whether it's to demonstrate the power of the government, whatever the intention is, I think you might find that this really remarkable engine of economic growth is going to slow down, possibly quite a bit over the next few years. I hope I'm wrong.
Let me turn to the questions that have come in. I'll start with Joshua Rosenwig, who asks, many people have tended to see US-China relations as cyclical in nature. Do you think that's accurate, or do you see more of a longer-term trend? If this cycle broke at some point, when did it break? That's for either of you, I'd say.
2008.
Mary, can you put back the graph? Is Mary there?
There we go.
Here we go. Okay, well, to Josh's question, and Josh is an old friend and colleague. So if you look at this graph, you will see that after Tiananmen, in fact, you do see quite a bit of up and down, even to the extent, it is cyclical during those years. But then when you look at, I guess, this is after, let's say this 2021, 2020. So after 2019, it's really linear. It's not cyclical. It's a straight line, and that line is down. As they say in Texas, it has the glide angle of a brick. It is down and going down. And by the way, this poll is typically taken in February and published shortly thereafter. And let's see what it is then. But if you look at that, it's down to a favorable of 20. So I would say there's a lot of cyclical movement in US-China relations as depicted by this. But then after 2019, you see a very, very sharp drop. And we can speculate about some of the reasons for that. The pandemic, of course, is one. But there are many others, the accusations of genocide, kind of big trade deficits, and I guess we've just had a record one with China. So that's how I would answer that. I think it has been cyclical, but more recently it's become linear.
Thank you. We got a question from Thomas Scott Bunton, who said, John, it's great to hear from you and see you via Zoom. Have you had any occasion yet to do any work on behalf of people who've been imprisoned because of their activities in Hong Kong?
Yes, of course. I have 3 or 4 channels for asking about or intervening on behalf of prisoners, which is the same thing. You know, you're asking, you're intervening. The first is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing and their embassy, yes, and consulates in the United States. And that's an important channel. Then I have another channel, which I use for prisoners in a particular province. So I have a central channel, I have a provincial channel. And I also have the Supreme Court of China, which I ask juvenile questions about juvenile offenders. We've done a lot of work with them on juvenile offenders. Okay, so those are 3. Let's see, the fourth is the Hong Kong government itself. Now, I have asked the Hong Kong government to help out on a few names. And, you know, I have to tell you something. It is very rare for the Chinese government to say, oh, yes, Mr. Kamm, we've done this. Right? We've released somebody because of you. They do not say that, believe me. I would point out, though, that the independence advocate Edward Leung has been a name that I have raised, and he has been released. So those are 4 channels. And aside from the Supreme Court, I have raised Hong Kong names through all 3. The Hong Kong government, the provincial government, a lot of Hong Kong people in that provincial government prisons, and finally, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Yes.
Can I just follow that up by asking what's your sense of the trajectory of Hong Kong? And this would be speculative, but do you really see it being fully integrated in China in the way that the government clearly wants? Do you see it as maintaining a level of distinctiveness over the long term? Either of you could answer that, I'm sure.
Well, you know, so again, I've spent 50 years going and many, many fond memories. I have to say, I think the current situation in Hong Kong is quite serious. I do not think that Hong Kong is currently enjoying the high level of autonomy that was promised to it. More and more, we're seeing institutions sinified. That's the right term. Mm-hmm. Basically, contrary to what the chief executive, Carrie Lam, says, what's going on is definitely an assault on media freedom. The elimination of Apple, the elimination of Stand, the arrests of journalists, and now apparently even the Economist and Wall Street Journal are being criticized by the Hong Kong government if they write anything about Hong Kong. So no, I don't think that, speaking of trajectory, I don't see a good ending to this.
Joe, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I would not differ at all. John knows Hong Kong much better than I do, but the situation seems to me that a decision was made at the highest level that Hong Kong would simply be integrated into the mainland, that it would be one more Chinese city. And that's, hopefully some people are not jailed because of what they did or believe before this change of policy, but it's not a good ending.
I may just add something to that. There's all kinds of talk about decoupling.
Yeah.
Decoupling. Well, okay, I personally don't see that. I mean, these are 2 big economies. There's a lot of exchange. However, I would point out that right now, you cannot enter Hong Kong or the mainland without undergoing quarantine if you can get a flight, because now flights are being suspended or canceled. And by the way, even airmail has been suspended. So, you know, you can talk all you want about decoupling in a very theoretical way, but it's decoupling if you can't go there, if you can't mail. You know, I mean, that's the reality. I would just point that out.
Thank you. I've got a couple of factual questions that came in when Joe was doing his presentation. Herbert Thomas asked about a name, Wang Huning in Pinyin. Is that right?
Wang Huning.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about him?
I think he just wanted to confirm the name.
Yeah. I can put that in the. What do I in the chat box?
In the chat
I
box.
can
Sure.
simply Wang Huning.
And there's another question, a related question by Dee Dee Downs. I don't understand your comment that Xi will seek a third term. I thought he was appointed for life, so there won't be a succession issue until he passes, ? Is that?
No, no. Every 5 years, there's a party Congress, and they choose a general secretary for 5 years. He's served 2 terms, 5-year terms, and at least Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao stepped down after 2 terms. So the expectation of many people was that Xi Jinping would do likewise. And now the expectation is that, no, he will go on for at least a 3rd term and probably a 4th.
Okay. Question from John Chiodo. I think it's directed to you, Joe. How many political factions are there vying for control of the party? And if any of them took power, would there be a significant difference in domestic or foreign policy?
Yeah, really hard to answer that question. You know, when you're talking about, first of all, factions are it's kind of a loosey-goosey term. Because there are people, say, that are very close to Xi Jinping, and you can say, yeah, those guys are Xi Jinping faction. You can say the same thing about people around Jiang Zemin and maybe Li Keqiang, the premier, things like that. But there are an awful lot of people that sort of try to be nice to everybody, and you know, they're not really factionalists, but they're part of wider networks. You know, certainly nobody ever says, gee, I'm against Xi Jinping. You wouldn't survive very long. I think that the interesting thing, and one of the reasons brought up the economy, is, you know, if you disagree with Xi Jinping, the way to criticize him is not to say, gee, there's no need to have such a bad relationship with the United States. You've just mishandled things, you should step down. You don't do that. But it might be possible to say, gee, I've noticed that the growth rate of the Chinese economy has really slipped for the last 10 years. And maybe we should be doing some other things in that regard. And I think you've had some pushback. You know, I think a lot of people perhaps were startled by the crackdown on Alibaba, for instance. I would imagine there are a lot of people in Shanghai and other places that would say, I don't know that I like where this is going. And so you could imagine different oppositions coming up that way. I don't think that was going to do anything before the 20th Party Congress in the fall. Would it perhaps have an effect on policy? Maybe. I think the question was, does a different faction have really different policy agendas? And I think probably not. You know, although you can say that maybe there's Jiang Zemin did certain things differently than Xi Jinping, but I don't think the country is ruled substantially differently, except Xi Jinping maybe is a little tougher on domestic control.
Thank you.
I definitely agree with that. And I'd like to point out, in fact, that I think Jiang Zemin appreciated the practice of strategic acts of clemency.
Oh, yes.
I know. I mean, he authorized me going to Tibet to help get out some Tibetan prisoners. Yes, so I see that. I do not see that with Mr. Xi at this time.
Right.
I hope he changes that approach. But at the moment, I'm sorry, they're not practicing strategic acts of clemency.
I remember after Tiananmen, when there were so many crackdowns and you and others were successful in getting people out, I commented to one of my friends about all these people being put in prison. And he said, but Joe, we can't let them out if we don't put them in prison.
Can I follow that up? There's a question from Joanna Shelton for John saying, given the poor state of US-China relations today, how are you able to conduct your work on behalf of individuals at all under present circumstances?
Well, thank you, Joanna. Well, yeah, it's a challenge, but I'm still able to do it. Very interestingly, now I use messaging apps. WeChat, for instance, okay, WeChat, which of course is being monitored. And I am asking about submitting lists via WeChat. So that's one way I'm able to do it. And the other is, of course, and I'm hoping more of this will happen, I do now have in-person, face-to-face meetings here in San Francisco. So, the work continues. My team is always looking for names. We have a political prisoner database that actually was started by Joshua Rosenzweig. We have that. I think now we're up to more than 45,000 records, 7,500 active cases, and we use the active registry to make lists. And we have lists for all kinds of purposes. Of course, we have the American list, Americans, but we have journalists. I've just done a big study and with several lists on practitioners of unorthodox religions, which is, by the way, the largest single group of political and religious prisoners. Falun Gong, Church of Almighty God, we have identified 41 of them. And so we are now asking about them as well. So the work goes on, it's based on research, it's tact, diplomacy, good communications. And well, so just for your information, since Dui Hua was founded in 1999, I was doing this for several years before that, but since 1999, we have submitted more than 500 lists with more than 6,000 names. Now that has duplicates. For instance, Mark Sweden, I must have asked about Mark 30, 40 times. So if you take out the duplications, I've asked about 2,500, gotten responses on more than 1,000, and several hundred have benefited from clemency, those on those lists. So that's by way of background.
Speaking of Mark Sweden, Amy Schiffer on our staff wanted to let you know that Catherine Sweden, his mother, is listening to us today. She goes on to say, Mark is an American who's been arbitrarily detained in China for 9 years. He was also declared an official hostage by the State Department. Can you just briefly talk about that case and why he's being held?
Well, he was accused of trafficking in drugs. The evidence is beyond circumstantial. It's almost non-existent, all right? The police burst into his hotel room. There were no drugs on his body. There were no drugs in his system. There's no history of him ever using drugs. They test you right away, blood and urine, no drugs in the system, okay? Boy, basically what it boils down to, at one point, he visited a factory, which at some point in the future, he was not there when it happened. Apparently, this factory was used by somebody, probably a drug cartel of some sort. And these guys tried to frame Mark for what happened. Now, I want to say beyond him being declared a hostage by the US government, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has declared him to have been arbitrarily detained and called on the Chinese government to release him and pay compensation. That has not happened, but I remind the Chinese all the time about that. So any of you who want to learn more, you can actually go on the Working Group of Arbitrary Detention and find their decision. I commend it to you. It is very thorough. Of course, with the UN, they give the Chinese government a chance to respond, and well, they did, but I don't think it was satisfactory. So that's what I would say about that case. It's a shocking travesty abuse of justice, and I'm so glad the US is finally treating it with the seriousness that it deserves.
Angeline Chen has a question that follows up the earlier discussion of Hong Kong. Has the crackdown in Hong Kong had a significant effect on US-China relations, or is it just part of the general bad news and bad vibe that seems to be characterizing the relationship at this point?
Well, I think it has had quite a big impact on US-China relations. You got to understand, there are a lot of Hong Kong people who live in the United States. I know many of them, okay? I've got one officer and one director who come from Hong Kong. And so there's a very big impact of what's going on in Hong Kong on US-China relations, for sure, no question. Joe?
Oh, I totally agree. I think it's absolutely breathtaking what's happened in Hong Kong, and I think it's had a terrible impact on, it kind of confirms all the worst opinions or thoughts in Washington. And so it's, and you compound that with the situation in Xinjiang, and it's just not a very good narrative.
Paul Ryer on our staff wants to thank you both for the fascinating presentations. He said, my question is, as a scholar of another still socialist polity, he works in Cuba. To what extent is socialist discourse of internationalism still evident in China today? And does that offset Chinese ethno-nationalism? If not, what forces do counter ethno-nationalism, and how might these be amplified? It's a good question.
I haven't thought much about communist internationalism in some time. I was, in fact, just before this meeting, I was teaching my first session of Chinese foreign policy, and I said, I bet one of you in midterm or final is going to say, well, of course, China and the Soviet Union allied out of communist solidarity. And I said, don't believe it. Mao and Stalin had very healthy understandings of their own national interests. If you look at China-Korea relations, they also have very healthy understanding of their interests. I guess I don't take communist internationalism very seriously from the beginning to the end. John, am I wrong?
No, I agree. Occasionally it rears its head. I think there was a ceremony in Cuba recently in which the Chinese ambassador went to it and talked about China's contribution to the Cuban Revolution. You see that from time to time. Of course, some of this is very sensitive because, of course, North Korea, which is the subject of sanctions, etc. So, China's solidarity with North Korea is not necessarily a strong card for China in Washington, that's for sure. So, but yeah, I agree with Joe. I rarely encounter it, to be honest with you. I go back a long time.
You do. Martha Sutherland says, I totally agree about Red Roulette. Good book, great read. Please comment on the lack of information from China about recent widespread lockdowns, such as the port of Ningbo, the largest in the country. Thank you, she says.
crackdowns because of COVID.
Well, that's what I presume. Like she calls it a lockdown. So,
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know anything specifically about Ningbo other than they have locked it down. And I assume that it is out of COVID, concerns over COVID. I mean, China has been draconian in their lockdowns, as you know. I love the story about the young woman who went over to a young man's apartment on a blind date, had dinner, and before she could leave for the evening, the building was locked down. And so she had to spend 2 weeks with this guy that she absolutely detested. You get weird stories like that because the lockdowns are just, they're total and they're imposed without prior notice. Yes, that will cause more problems in shipping and things. That's a very big port. So I don't know how long it's going to be locked down, but I think that at some point, China has got to change their strategy because the Omicron, highly contagious, has now hit China. And so I just don't think you can attack the Omicron variant with lockdowns. But what comes next, and whether Xi Jinping will be identified with the lockdown strategy and this becomes another political cudgel, all sorts of games are going to be played.
But there's no evident pushback from the population against this draconian lockdown policy?
No, they're not that we know of.
Interesting. Well, let's wind down with two tough questions for you. You've gotten off easily so far. One of them is from Gay Miller. What about the future of Taiwan?
I care very much about the future of Taiwan. I did live there for 3 years. I go back pretty much annually. That's one place where I have gone with a group of Americans to Taipei and then to Beijing to try to talk about. And those conversations have gotten tougher and tougher. And of course, they haven't happened at all over the last, 2 years. I argue that it is not in China's interest to attack or reincorporate because I think the price that China will pay is really extraordinary. I'm not sure that Xi Jinping agrees with me. The problem right now is this is one of these downward spirals where Chinese threats to Taiwan go up, and so the United States sells more weapons, or now we have apparently military trainers in Taiwan, and so China sees a restoration of the defense relationship with Taiwan that we broke in order to establish relations, and so their threats go up, and so our relationship with Taiwan gets closer. And I think that this is a tough one to back off of. It really is, because this is an extremely emotional issue in China. And yet there is a burgeoning Taiwanese nationalism in Taiwan. And, I'm perfectly happy. I'm not Taiwanese, but I'm perfectly happy with the original deal, which the Taiwan gets its separateness, but not its independent statehood. And I do see the mainland as pushing that. I see the United States as pushing back. And somehow we need to back off of this, because this is, again, a situation that doesn't look like it's going to have a happy ending. I think that there are people in China in high places that disagree strongly with Xi Jinping's harsh stance on Taiwan. But again, this gets into very tough policy-making arguments. I don't think anything is going to happen on it before the 20th Party Congress. It's nasty.
John, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree with Joe. I don't think that military action certainly is not imminent. I think that China will continue to pressure Taiwan. It will continue to try to break Taiwan's links. It will continue to keep Taiwan out of international bodies. It will fly its jets in the near Taiwan, their air defense zone. But I don't think that they will attempt to invade Taiwan. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, this is an island of 22 million people. And you could easily get bogged down in a very, very costly war. I see that they're training for urban warfare. And, you know, it's the old Churchill, we will fight you in the hills, we will fight you in the streets, we will fight you everywhere. And that's going to be very costly. And of course, as Joe points out, the impact on China's international reputation would be very strong. So I think I'll leave it there.
All right. Well, let's end on one question. This is presented by Amy Schiffer on our staff on behalf of Elisa Reina. How about some closing thoughts on how the U.S. might improve relations with China, if it's willing, I suppose, because there's a populist narrative here that's very hostile to the Chinese, as you both pointed out.
Well, I mean, I think John has at least part of the solution. Release a couple of prisoners. Stop the extreme pressure on Taiwan. Find a different foreign ministry spokesman. The Zhao Lijian approach, so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, only makes things worse. I guess you asked about what the U.S. could do, and I responded what China could do. It would, I think that both sides could take some steps. You know, I don't think that we're going to get out of this deadlock anytime soon, but gosh, you got to start somewhere, and you could improve the atmosphere relatively quickly and easily. And I think that would make it much easier to deal with some of the tariff issues. Then maybe we can talk about some of the other really tough issues. But yeah, I think that a hostile relationship is not good for the United States, and it's not good for China. And so I think there's a good reason to try to back out of it.
John, any closing thoughts on that?
Well, yes, and again, I touched on a little of this when I spoke. Look, right now, the countries are hardly speaking to each other. Yeah. As I pointed out, we used to have actually more than 60 dialogues and consultations. Now we're down to 5. There is no human rights dialogue. Now, of course, people have said, well, what's the use of that, et cetera. But I tell you what, I can tell you what, if some of these names I've mentioned, like Mark Sweden and others, could be brought up in an official dialogue with officials from both sides of the table, I think that would be useful, all right? That's my opinion. Now, there are other dialogues that could be resumed, but of course, I think human rights dialogue is the most important. The Chinese are open to resuming that dialogue. We are not. So time and time again, I see that the United States is basically not interested in talking to the Chinese. Another thing that we can do, and which I believe an MIT professor has just had the charges dropped against him, you know, this so-called China initiative, where you target, in particular, academics of Chinese descent. This is not helping relations. Right. It is not helping relations. So I would scale that back. If you have legitimate concerns about espionage, that's one thing. But to go after scholars of Chinese descent, and of course, as you can see, the charges has been dropped. And this is not the first time. If you go all the way back to Wen Ho Lee, which is more than 15 years ago, that too was a case that was dropped. So I would name those. Certainly, you could start by maybe lifting a few tariffs, not the whole thing, maybe cut them in half, I don't know. But you know, there definitely are things that can be done, all right? It can be done to improve U.S.-China relations on both sides, as Joe points out, both sides. Okay?
All right. Well, John Kamm, Joseph Fewsmith, I want to thank you for an illuminating and memorable conversation. And I'd like to thank our large audience for their questions and for their attention. And I'd like to welcome that audience to a series of talks that will be starting next month on the topic of justice, funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we will have more detailed information about that on our website, sarweb.org. We'll have that up fairly soon, and that'll carry on through the spring. So again, thanks to you both. It's by the miracle of the internet, we had both coasts represented, plus here in the heartland in northern New Mexico, and the internet was our friend today. Everything worked right. So thank you both, and it's a pleasure to meet you, Joe, and a pleasure as always to see you again, John Kamm.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank
This has
you.
been a great pleasure.
Thank you very much.
So long, everybody.
Goodbye.
Yeah.